The coin was almost warm in Annie's palm. Almost, but not quite. She had held it so long that it should have taken her heat by now. Yet the copper refused to yield, staying cold as the stone wall she pressed her back against. That small, stubborn coldness felt like a sign, though she could not name of what. Around her, the market square of Dunviel hummed with the noise of a kingdom preparing to witness something it would speak of for years. Banners of deep crimson and black hung from every post and beam, snapping in the late autumn wind. The smell of roasting pine knots and spiced cider filled the air, and beneath it ran a sharper scent, horse leather, iron, and the particular tension that gathered in crowds before something powerful passed through them. People pressed against one another along the cobblestones, their breath rising in pale clouds. Wool cloaks and fur-lined hoods pressed together in the cold. Annie pulled her gray wool cape tighter and studied the single coin in her hand. It was all she had left. The innkeeper at the Hound's Rest had been generous enough, or perhaps merely careless, to give her 3 more nights before demanding payment. 3 nights to find work in a city that did not know her name, in a kingdom where an unmarked Omega with no pack seal carried less worth than a chipped clay mug. She had left the village of Caldenmore 6 days ago with a small bundle of bread, a letter of character from the old healer who had trained her, and the quiet, stubborn belief that somewhere in the capital of Dunviel, someone would need what she knew. She could read herbs. She could read wounds. She had spent 4 years at old Mira's side learning which roots drew poison from a cut and which bark brewed fevers down to nothing. That had to be worth something. So far, it had not been. 3 apothecary stalls had turned her away when they saw she bore no guild mark. A noble household had sent her around to the servants' entrance, and the housekeeper there had looked at her cape. Plain, no emblem, no color, and shaken her head before Annie could speak. A curandero working near the tannery district had listened to her speak for nearly 10 minutes, before quietly informing her that he had no coin to pay a second apprentice, and that she might try the military quarter, where soldiers were always in need of someone to sew them back together. She had not gone to the military quarter. The military quarter meant alpha soldiers, and alpha soldiers meant questions about rank and bloodline, and pack allegiance that she could not answer without lowering her eyes and admitting she had none. An unbound Omega, 23 years old, traveling alone. She had seen what that admission did to people's expressions. The square around her surged. A horn sounded from the eastern road, low, long, and commanding, the kind of sound that did not ask for attention but simply took it. The crowd shifted forward as one body, and Annie was pushed sideways along the wall, her boots scraping the uneven stone. She caught the wooden frame of a merchant's stall to keep her balance, splinters catching the wool of her glove. "The king's procession," someone behind her breathed, and the word king rippled through the crowd the way a stone ripples a pond, outward, instant, unstoppable. Annie had not known there would be a procession today. She had come to the square because the market here sold cheaper grain than the stalls near the inn, and she needed to make 1 copper coin stretch far enough to eat tonight, and perhaps tomorrow. The procession was not her concern. She had no stake in kings, but the crowd had other ideas about where she would stand. Another surge, harder than the first, knocked her fully off the wall and sent her stumbling into the narrow lane that cut between the square and the royal road. She caught herself on a hitching post, breathing hard, and looked up. The procession was closer than she had expected. 4 mounted guards rode at the front, their black and crimson cloaks streaming behind them, the hooves of their horses sending sparks off the stone road. Behind them rolled a carriage, not the ornate, gilded kind she had imagined from stories, but something heavier and more deliberate. Black lacquered wood with iron fittings, the curtains drawn so completely that not a thread of light escaped from inside. The horses pulling it were enormous, dark bay animals with braided manes and iron-shod hooves that struck the road like hammers. A second horn sounded, and the crowd pressed back from the lane, back toward Annie, crushing her further forward until her boots were nearly in the road itself. She turned to push through the bodies behind her, but they were packed too tightly. Wool and fur and sharp elbows surrounded her. Someone stepped on the hem of her cape, and she pitched forward, arms out, breath gone entirely from her lungs. She caught the iron handle of the carriage door. She did not know, in that precise moment, that it was the king's own carriage. She knew only that her fingers had closed around cold metal, and that it was the only thing standing between her and the road beneath those enormous hooves. She hung there for one terrible second, half falling, half holding, the carriage still moving, her boots dragging on the stone. Then the door gave. It swung inward, unlocked, unlatched, swinging with awful ease. And Annie went with it, tumbling across the threshold and landing hard on the floor of the carriage's interior. The door swung shut behind her with a clean, decisive sound, as if it had been waiting for exactly this to happen. Silence. The noise of the crowd vanished as though swallowed. The thick walls of the carriage held the world out entirely. The interior smelled of leather and cedar wood, something dark and wood smoke deep beneath both, and the faint, metallic trace of old parchment. A single iron lantern hung from the ceiling, its small flame swaying with the movement of the wheels. Annie lay on the floor for one full breath, not moving. Then she became aware, in the particular bone-deep way that prey becomes aware of a predator, that she was not alone. She looked up. He was sitting across from her, completely still. Long dark braids fell over broad shoulders encased in black leather armor, the kind worn by men who did not dress for ceremony, but for the habit of readiness. Braided leather straps crossed his chest in a pattern of deliberate function, connected by iron buckles worn smooth with use. His forearms rested on his knees, and around each wrist was a thick leather bracer, dark and unmarked. A short black fur rested across his shoulders, not a cloak, more like a thing that had simply decided to stay there. His jaw was covered in a close, dark beard, and beneath the edge of one braid near his temple, a thin pale scar curved across his cheekbone like a signature. His eyes were the color of winter sky over still water. He was looking at her, the way she imagined the sea looked at a leaf that had fallen into it. Not with malice, not even with surprise, but with a kind of absolute, encompassing attention that made other things feel irrelevant. Annie scrambled to her feet, or tried to. The carriage swayed and she caught the edge of the seat to steady herself, her heart hammering against her ribs, her gray cape askew, her long blonde braid fallen half loose over one shoulder. She began. Her voice came out wrong, smaller than she intended. I am deeply sorry. I lost my footing. I did not mean. I will leave at once. She turned toward the door and reached for the handle. The lock clicked. Not loudly. Barely a sound at all, really. Just the soft final movement of iron sliding into place. She turned back. He had not moved. His hand rested on a small iron lever built into the wall beside his seat, a lever she had not noticed before, and he was watching her with those still blue eyes and an expression that revealed nothing, except that he had made a decision. "Sit down," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried the particular quality of a sound accustomed to being obeyed without repetition. Annie's hand remained on the door handle. "The door is locked," he confirmed, with the tone of a man stating a fact, not offering an apology. "Sit down." She stared at him. She had been trained by old Mira to read bodies the way other people read words, to see in posture and breath and the set of a jaw what people would not say aloud. What she read in the man across from her was not threat, precisely. It was something more unsettling than threat. It was certainty. The certainty of someone who had already considered every possible outcome of this moment and found each one acceptable. "Who are you?" she whispered, though the banners and the horns and the crowd's reverence had already begun assembling an answer she did not want. He tilted his head the smallest degree. "Sit down," he said for the third time. and I will tell you." Annie sat down. Outside, the procession continued toward the castle. The crowd cheered, and the sound reached them as something muffled and distant. The world reduced to this: a swaying carriage, a locked door, a lantern flame, and two people sitting across from each other. One of them a king who had not explained himself, and one of them a girl with a single copper coin and no idea what she had just fallen into. He let the silence sit between them for a long moment before he spoke. That was the first thing Annie noticed about him. Not his size, not the quiet authority in his voice, not even the locked door. It was the silence. He wore it the way other men wore armor, completely and without discomfort, as though the absence of words cost him nothing at all. "My name is Lucian," he said finally, "King of Valdenmoor, Lord of the Northern Reaches, Alpha of the Iron Blood Pack." Annie's hands were folded in her lap. She did not let them tighten, though every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to do something, to apologize more profusely, to press herself into the corner of the seat, to make herself as small and unremarkable as possible. She had spent a great deal of her life practicing that particular skill. But old Mira had told her once that the worst thing a person could do in front of a predator was flinch, not because flinching invited attack, but because it told the predator everything about you before you had a chance to decide what you wanted them to know. So she kept her hands still, and she met his eyes. "Annie," she said, "of Caldenmoor, healer's apprentice. No pack affiliation." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, not enough to be called surprise, but enough that she noticed it. A faint sharpening of attention, as if she had said something mildly unexpected. She did not know what she had said, so she did not try to unsay it. "Caldenmoor," he repeated. "It is a village, to the east, past the Greywold Forest. I know where it is." His voice did not change in tone, but there was something behind the words now, a thread she could not quite catch. He studied her face for a moment longer, then sat back against the carriage wall, the leather of his armor creaking softly with the movement. "You fell into my carriage." "Yes." From the crowd. The crowd pushed forward when the horn sounded. I lost my footing. I caught the door handle. I did not know it was unlatched, and I certainly did not know. She paused. Whose carriage it was. "You would not have entered it if you had known." It was not a question, but she answered it anyway. "No, I would not have." He nodded once, the way a man nods when information confirms something he had already suspected. His blue gaze moved from her face to her cape, then to the half-loosened braid over her shoulder, then to her hands. Annie resisted the urge to hide them. They were not noble hands. They were healer's hands, rough at the knuckles from washing and cold water, stained faintly at the fingertips with dried herbs she had ground at the inn this morning, black root and dried fennel, hoping to sell a small remedy to someone at the market. "Why are you in Dunvale?" he asked. "I am looking for work. As a healer. As whatever someone will pay me to do, that does not require a guild seal or a pack mark." She said it plainly, because it was plain truth, and because something told her this man would find evasion less tolerable than directness. "I have neither." The carriage rolled on. Outside, the cheering had faded as they moved away from the densest part of the market square, and the sound of the wheels changed as cobblestone gave way to the smoother flagged road that led toward the upper city and the castle walls. Annie was acutely aware of the direction they were traveling. Toward the castle. Away from the inn. Away from the market. Away from everything familiar in a city that had not been familiar to begin with. "You have training," Lucian said. 4 years under Mira of Caldenmoor. She was a guild healer in the capital before she retired to the village. She taught me preparation, diagnosis, wound treatment, fever management, An herb lore. Annie paused. She died 3 months ago. The village had no need of a second healer, and the new man they brought in had his own apprentice. So I came here. He was quiet for a moment. And in 6 days, you have found no position. She looked at him sharply. How did you know it has been 6 days? The innkeeper at the Hound's Rest sent a report to the castle guard, as all innkeepers in Dunvale are required to do when an unaffiliated Omega registers for lodging. His tone was matter-of-fact, unbothered. It is a safety measure. Annie felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the carriage walls. I am being watched? You were noted. There is a difference. He held her gaze steadily. An unbound Omega traveling alone into the capital is unusual enough to warrant attention. It does not mean you are suspected of anything. It means the city is aware of you. She thought about that. She thought about the 3 nights remaining at the inn, the single copper coin, and the way every door had closed quietly in her face over the past 6 days. She thought about what it meant that a king, this king, sitting 4 feet away from her with locked-door certainty and winter-blue eyes, had known her name and the length of her stay without her ever having introduced herself to anyone of consequence. Is that why you locked the door? She asked quietly. Because the city is aware of me? I locked the door, he said, because you were about to step out of a moving carriage onto a stone road, and the horses behind mine would not have stopped in time. Annie opened her mouth, closed it, looked at the door, then back at him. She had not considered that. The carriage slowed as it began to climb the incline toward the castle gate. She could hear the deep voices of guards exchanging words with the driver, the groan of iron hinges as the gate swung open, the changed echo of the wheels as they passed beneath the stone arch and into the inner courtyard. When the carriage finally stopped, the sudden stillness felt strange after the long roll of motion. Lucian reached for the iron lever beside his seat and released the lock. The soft click of it opening was exactly as quiet as the click of it closing had been. He did not open the door immediately. He looked at her once more, with that same encompassing, unhurried attention, and said, "The castle has a healing ward. It has been understaffed since the last moon plague took 2 of the senior curanderos. The head healer, Brother Oswin, has been requesting additional hands for 2 months." Annie went very still. "I am not offering charity," he added before she could speak. "The ward is difficult work. The patients include soldiers with wounds that do not heal cleanly, and pack members with conditions that require patience and knowledge of wolf physiology. It is not a comfortable post." "I am not looking for comfortable," she said. "No." Something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a shift toward warmth moved through his expression. "I gathered that." He pushed the carriage door open. Cold air swept in, smelling of pine smoke and stone and the particular sharp green scent of the castle's inner courtyard, where moss grew between the flagstones. A guard appeared immediately at the door, hand extended to assist, his eyes going from the king to Annie and back again with carefully controlled blankness. Annie stepped down from the carriage, her boots meeting the courtyard stone. She stood in the shadow of the castle walls and looked up at the gray towers rising against an iron-colored sky, the crimson banners pulling in the wind high above, and she felt something she had not felt in 6 days. Not safety, exactly, not certainty, but the faint, stubborn sense that a door had opened, though this one, at least, she had not fallen through by accident. She turned back. Lucian had stepped down from the carriage behind her and stood now on the courtyard stones, several inches taller than she had registered in the confined space of the carriage, his black braids moving in the cold wind, his blue eyes finding her immediately. "Brother Oswin will be informed you are coming," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the great doors of the castle, his black fur cloak settling around his shoulders. His stride neither fast nor slow, the walk of a man entirely without urgency, because the world arranged itself around him rather than the other way. 2 castle guards fell into step beside him without a word. Annie stood alone in the courtyard for a long moment, the cold flagstones beneath her boots, the wind pulling at the loose end of her half-undone braid. Somewhere above her, a raven landed on the edge of a tower and regarded her with one black eye. She had arrived in Dunvael looking for a door that would open. She had found one. She was not yet certain what lived on the other side of it. A firm voice broke through the courtyard, quiet from her left. "You must be the one who fell into the king's carriage." Annie turned. A woman stood at the entrance to the eastern wing, broad-shouldered, perhaps 50 years of age, with close-cropped gray hair and a healer's sash of deep blue across the front of her plain wool robes. Her arms were crossed, and her expression communicated clearly that she had formed a preliminary judgment and was only partially willing to revise it. "I am Ren," the woman said, without warmth but without hostility either. "Senior healer, Brother Oswin's deputy. You will work under me." She looked Annie over, head to foot, the way a craftsman looks at raw material. "Can you set a broken hand without a splint guide?" "Yes," Annie said. Ren's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you use for a wound that will not close after 3 days?" "Depends on the cause. If infection, blackroot compress and drainage. If pack healing has stalled, there is usually a secondary issue, emotional suppression or incomplete shift. You treat the wolf, not just the wound." The gray-haired woman was quiet for 3 full seconds. "Come inside," she said, and turned without another word. Annie followed her through the eastern door and into the warmth and candlelight of the healing wing, the heavy door swinging shut behind her against the cold. And somewhere above, in a tower window she could not see, she did not know that a pair of winter-blue eyes watched until she disappeared from the courtyard entirely. The healing ward smelled of beeswax candles, dried lavender, and underneath both, the iron-tinged scent of old blood that no amount of scrubbing ever fully removed from stone floors. Annie noticed it the moment she crossed the threshold, not with revulsion, but with the particular recognition of someone who had spent years in rooms like this one. It was the smell of work that mattered. She found it steadying. Ren moved through the ward with the efficiency of a woman who had long ago stopped seeing the space around her as a room and had begun seeing it as a system. She pointed things out without slowing. The herb cabinet along the north wall, organized by function rather than name. The linen chest near the window, where dressings were sorted by size. The iron brazier in the corner that kept the room warm enough for patients in shock. The narrow door at the far end that led to the private rooms for severe cases. She spoke quickly and without repetition, and Annie understood instinctively that she was being tested not on what she knew, but on how fast she could absorb what she was being shown. "We have 11 patients currently," Ren said, stopping at a wooden table near the center of the ward, where a row of clay pots stood in careful order. 3 soldiers with wounds from the border skirmished last fortnight. 1 pack elder with joint swelling that does not respond to standard compress. 2 children from the servant quarters with river fever. They are past the worst, but still weak. 5 others with various conditions. She turned and fixed Annie with a direct look. "You will not treat anyone independently until I have observed you work for 3 days. You will ask before you act. You will not speak to patients about their pack status, rank, or anything that touches on court matters. Do you understand?" "Yes," Annie said. "If a patient is an alpha, you address them as such. If they are a guard or soldier, you address them by rank. If you do not know the rank, you address them as Sir or My Lady, and ask Brother Oswin later." Ren paused. "If the king comes to the ward—" "Has he ever?" Annie asked, before she could stop herself. Ren looked at her for a moment. "He has not visited the ward in 2 years. Not since—" She stopped, and the pause lasted precisely long enough to feel deliberate. "Not recently," she finished, and moved on. Annie filed that pause carefully and said nothing. Her first 3 days in the healing ward passed in the particular blur of hard, absorbing work that left no space for anything else. She rose before dawn when the candles in the ward were still the only light, changed dressings while the castle above her was still sleeping, prepared the morning herb preparations while Ren read the night notes left by the young apprentice boy, Pell, who kept watch through the darkest hours. Pell was perhaps 16, slight and brown-haired, with ink-stained fingers and the careful, earnest manner of someone trying very hard not to make mistakes. He regarded Annie with cautious curiosity for the first 2 days, and then, on the third morning, slid a bowl of hot porridge onto the table beside her without comment, and went back to his notes. She understood that to be his version of acceptance. The soldiers were her first real test. 3 men from the border company, all alphas, all carrying wounds that should have begun closing within a day under normal pack healing. They had not. The cuts were clean, sword wounds, not claw. But there was a quality to them that kept pulling Annie's attention back. On the afternoon of her second day, while Ren was attending the elder in the far room, she stood at the bedside of the youngest soldier, a man named Karen, and studied the wound on his forearm with the concentrated quiet that old Mira had called her reading face. "It is not healing because it wants to," she said aloud, half to herself. Corin looked at her with the flat suspicion that soldiers reserved for people who spoke cryptically near their injuries. "What does that mean?" "It means something in the wound is actively preventing the pack healing from taking hold." She leaned closer. Not touching, just looking. "Was there anything on the blade that struck you? Anything unusual?" The soldier's jaw tightened. It was a clean blade. "I am not doubting your account," she said, keeping her voice level. "I am asking because there is a residue here that should not be present after 11 days. It is very faint. If I did not know what I was looking for, I would miss it entirely." She straightened and met his eyes directly. Someone applied something to that blade before the fight. Something meant to interfere with pack healing. The silence that followed was of a different quality than the ordinary silences of a healing ward. It had weight to it. Corin stared at her. "That is a serious claim." "Yes," she agreed. "It is." She brought it to Ren that evening, laying out her observations carefully, her voice steady. Ren listened without interrupting, which Annie had already come to understand was her way of paying attention. When Annie finished, the older woman was quiet for a long moment, her gray eyes fixed on the middle distance. "You are certain," Ren said. It was not a question. "I am certain enough to say it aloud, which is more certain than I am about most things." Ren rose from the table and went to the herb cabinet, standing before it for a moment before selecting 2 small clay jars. She brought them back and set them on the table. "Black fern extract," she said, touching one. "Null root reduction," touching the other. "Mixed in the correct proportion and applied to a blade edge, they would do exactly what you have described." She looked at Annie steadily. "This is not common knowledge. It is restricted lore." "How do you know it?" "Mira," Annie said. "She told me once that knowing what can be done to a wound means knowing how to undo it. She said it made her a better healer. I did not know at the time why she knew of such things." Ren's expression shifted into something complicated that Annie could not fully read. She picked up the 2 jars and placed them back in the cabinet, closing it with a soft click. "I will bring this to the King's Gamma Commander," she said. "Tonight. You will document what you observed in writing. I will give you parchment, and you will sign it. Brother Oswin will countersign." She turned back. "You did well to bring this to me rather than speaking of it to others." Annie nodded. But before Ren could move away, she asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since that morning. "The other 2 soldiers with the same wound pattern, are they carrying the same residue?" Ren stopped. "You checked?" "Before I came to you. Yes. All 3 are affected." She paused. which means it was not a single incident or a lucky strike. Someone planned it. The candles in the ward seemed to burn a shade lower in the silence that followed. Outside the narrow windows, the wind moved through the castle courtyard, and somewhere in the distance, a guard called the evening watch. The sound of it felt, in that moment, very far away. She did not expect to see the king again so soon. It was the 5th day of her posting in the ward, and she was in the stone alcove at the back of the eastern corridor, grinding dried fennel into powder by the light of a single tallow candle, when she heard the outer door of the ward open. She heard Wren's footsteps. She had already learned to distinguish them from Pell's lighter shuffle and the soldier's heavier tread. And then another set of footsteps, longer strided and unhurried, that she had not heard in the ward before. She came around the corner of the alcove with the grinding bowl still in her hands and stopped. Lucian stood in the center of the ward, his black braids loose over his shoulders, wearing a simpler version of the leather armor she had first seen him in. No fur this time, the iron buckles of his chest straps catching the candlelight. He was speaking quietly with Wren, his head slightly inclined toward the shorter woman in the way that very tall men sometimes bent toward those they were actually listening to. There was a thin, fresh cut along the back of his left hand that he appeared entirely unbothered by. Wren saw Annie first and gave the smallest inclination of her head, not a dismissal, but a direction. Annie understood it as, stay and be useful. She crossed the ward and stopped a respectful distance away, setting the grinding bowl on the nearest table. Lucian's eyes moved to her with the same immediate quality she remembered from the carriage, as if some part of him was always aware of the room's perimeter. "Annie of Caldenmore," he said. "My Lord King," she said. Then, because the cut on his hand was directly in her line of sight, and she was, before anything else, a healer. "That should be cleaned." Wren made a sound that might have been the very beginning of a suppressed laugh. Lucian looked at the back of his hand, as if mildly surprised to find the wound still there. "It is a sparring cut. It will close. It will close faster and more cleanly if it is washed and dressed. With your permission." She moved to the linen chest before he answered, which she recognized was slightly presumptuous. But she had found over the past 5 days that hesitating in a healing ward rarely served anyone. She returned with a clean cloth and a small clay pot of her own prepared salt and fennel wash. He offered his hand without further argument. She worked quickly and carefully, the way Mira had taught her, cleaning from the center outward, no pressure on the edges, checking the depth with a gentle touch. His hand was large, the skin across his knuckles hardened from years of weapons training, a map of old and faded scars beneath the fresh one. She kept her attention on the wound, and not on the fact that the room felt different with him in it, heavier and more alert, as if the air itself was paying attention. "Wren tells me you identified the blade treatment on the border soldiers," he said. His voice was quiet and even. "Yes. She says you found the residue before she did." "She would have found it. I simply happened to look first." Annie applied a light dressing and secured it with a strip of linen, tying it neatly at the wrist. The more important matter is what the discovery means for the border company. If someone poisoned those blades before the skirmish, they had knowledge of the fighters in advance. That is not a matter of healing. That is a matter of strategy. She released his hand and stepped back. Lucian turned his wrist over once, examining the dressing with brief attention, then looked up at her. In the candlelight, the thin scar along his cheekbone was more visible than it had been in the carriage, and she found herself wondering, for just a moment, what kind of blade had made it, and how long ago. "You are not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "Someone quieter," he said. Annie looked at him. "Would quieter have been more useful to you in the carriage?" The corner of his mouth moved, barely, the smallest possible displacement, and then it was still again. But she had seen it. "No," he said. "It would not." He turned to speak again with Wren, and Annie returned to the alcove and her grinding bowl, and she did not allow herself to think too carefully about the warmth that had settled somewhere in her chest, small and uninvited and entirely inconvenient. Because she was not here for kings. She was here for work. She was here to build something that was hers, earned and solid and real, from the ground up. She told herself that twice more before she believed it even partially. Winter arrived at Valdenmoor the way it always did. Not gradually, but all at once, as though the sky had simply decided overnight that the season of cold would begin now and the world had better accept it. Annie woke on the 12th day of her posting to find frost on the inside of the narrow window above her small cot in the healer's quarters, and the courtyard outside sheeted in white that had not been there when she had finally extinguished her candle past midnight. She lay still for a moment, watching her own breath rise in pale clouds toward the stone ceiling, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something that resembled, distantly, the sensation of being somewhere she was supposed to be. She did not examine it too closely. She got up, wrapped her gray cape over her work dress, twisted her blonde braid into a knot at the back of her neck, and went to light the brazier in the ward. The days had settled into a rhythm that suited her. She was in the ward before Wren, which Wren had noted without comment on the 3rd day, and had not mentioned again, which Annie understood as the older woman's way of approving. Pell brought porridge. The soldiers were improving. 2 of them were nearly ready to return to their quarters, the blade treatment having been neutralized by a specific preparation that Annie had suggested, and Wren had confirmed was correct. The elder, with joint swelling, had responded to a longer course of warm compress and a particular root tea that Annie had found in an old volume in the ward's small shelf of reference manuscripts, a technique that Mira had once described in passing, and that Annie had never expected to use. Brother Oswin had visited twice. He was an old man, paper-thin and deliberate, with the manner of someone who had outlived his own sense of urgency. He had asked Annie 3 questions about herb interactions on his first visit and said, upon hearing her answers, "Yes, that will do," which Wren had later informed her was the closest Brother Oswin came to high praise. What she had not expected was Wren. She had prepared herself for the gray-haired woman's skepticism, had categorized it on that first afternoon as professional distance, and had planned to work through it steadily with competence and patience. What she had not prepared for was the way Wren's distance was not coldness at all, but a kind of careful attention, the attention of someone who had been disappointed before and was not in a hurry to be disappointed again. By the end of the first week, Wren had begun explaining things to Annie rather than simply directing her. By the end of the second, she had started asking Annie's opinion before offering her own. On the morning of the 12th day, while they were preparing the daily herb rounds, Wren said without preamble, "He came to the ward." Annie did not look up from the mortar. "I know. I was here." "He has not come to the ward in 2 years," Wren said. "Not since his mate died." The grinding stopped. Annie set the pestle down carefully and looked up. Wren was not looking at her. She was arranging clay pots on the shelf with the deliberate focus of someone who had chosen to say something difficult while keeping her hands occupied. "I did not know," Annie said quietly. "Few speak of it openly. It is not forbidden, simply—" Wren paused, selecting her next word with care. "Understood to be a matter that belongs to him alone." She placed the last pot on the shelf. Her name was Serana. She was beta-born, gentle, and entirely unsuited to court life, which she endured without complaint for 3 years. She died of a fever that came on fast and did not give us enough time. The older woman finally turned to look at Annie directly. "The 2 senior curanderos we lost in the moon plague last year. They were the ones who had treated her. I believe the king has found it difficult to enter this room since then." Annie thought of the way he had stood in the center of the ward on the evening of his visit, the candles throwing shadows across the old stone walls, and she understood something now about the quality of stillness she had observed in him. It was not merely the stillness of a man accustomed to authority. It was the stillness of someone who had learned to hold grief at a very specific distance, close enough to feel its shape, far enough to keep standing. "Why are you telling me this?" Annie asked, not defensively, genuinely. Ren looked at her for a long moment. "Because you are not as invisible in this castle as you seem to think you are," she said, and picked up the next jar. The answer to that arrived 3 days later, in the form of Lady Isolde. Annie heard her before she saw her, the particular rhythm of heeled boots on stone that announced rank before the face did, accompanied by the swish of rich fabric and the softer footsteps of 2 attendants trailing behind. She was in the corridor outside the ward when the lady turned the corner, and there was no graceful way to step aside in time, so Annie simply stopped and waited. Lady Isolde was perhaps 35, with dark hair coiled elaborately at the back of her head and held with silver pins, and eyes the color of deep amber that took in Annie's gray cape and plain dress with a single seamless assessment. She was beautiful in the way that well-maintained things were beautiful, deliberately, carefully, and with full awareness of the effect. The gown she wore was deep green wool trimmed at the collar and cuffs with dark fur, and around her throat she wore a chain of silver set with stones that caught the torchlight of the corridor. "You are the new healer," Isolde said. Her voice was smooth and pleasantly modulated, the kind of voice that said whatever it wanted while sounding entirely reasonable. "I am the ward assistant," Annie said. "Lady Isolde of House Varen." She smiled, and it reached far enough to be convincing. "I have heard about you. The girl who fell into the king's carriage." She said it with gentle amusement, as though it were a charming story, the kind told at feasts to make people laugh. What a remarkable way to begin. "It was an accident," Annie said. "Of course it was." Isolde tilted her head slightly. "You have settled in well, I am told. The king's ward, the king's healing staff, the king's favor, one might say." The smile remained perfectly in place. Annie met her gaze steadily. "I work in the healing ward. I have no claim to anyone's favor." "No," Isolde agreed pleasantly. "Of course not." She let the words breathe for a moment, then added, as if an afterthought, "The king will need to consider his next formal bond within the year. The council has been quite clear on the matter. Valdenmoor requires an heir, and the AlphaKing cannot remain unbound indefinitely." She adjusted the silver chain at her throat with one elegant finger. "I simply thought you should be aware of how things stand, so that no one finds themselves in an uncomfortable position through simple ignorance." She smiled once more, inclined her head in a gesture that was polite and final all at once, and continued down the corridor with her attendants trailing behind her, her heeled boots ringing against the stone, until the sound faded around the next turn. Annie stood in the corridor for a moment after she had gone. The torch on the wall beside her guttered in a draft from somewhere, and she watched the flame recover and straighten. She understood the message precisely. It had been delivered too gracefully to be called a threat, but it was a boundary all the same, drawn clearly in the stone between them. What troubled her was not the warning itself. What troubled her was that Lady Isolde had clearly thought it necessary. She was still turning it over in her mind that evening when she found herself in the castle library, which she had discovered by accident on her 4th day, when she had taken a wrong turning on the way back from the storeroom. She had returned to it twice since, drawn by the warmth of the great fireplace and the presence of old volumes on herb lore that the ward's small shelf could not rival. The librarian, an ancient man named Dorvey, who communicated primarily through sighs and occasional nods, had established a wordless understanding with her that she might use the shelves so long as she returned everything to its precise original position. She was reading a volume on wolf physiology, specifically the suppression of pack healing under emotional distress, which connected to the observation she had made about the soldiers, when she heard someone else enter the library. She did not look up immediately, because Dorvey came and went at odd hours, and she had learned not to disrupt her reading for his movements. But the footstep pattern was wrong. Too long a stride. Too certain. The sound of boots that had walked many different floors and found none of them remarkable. She looked up. Lucian stood at the far end of the long table, looking at the shelf nearest the window with his arms loosely crossed, still wearing the day's leather armor, the black braids falling over his shoulders. He had not seen her yet. She was at the shadowed far end of the table, half behind a tall stack of volumes, and the firelight did not quite reach that corner. She had perhaps 3 seconds in which to quietly close the book and excuse herself before he became aware of her. She used them to make a decision, and the decision she made surprised her somewhat. She stayed. "There is a text on border territory law at the end of that shelf," she said. "Second from the left. Dorve keeps it misshelved under natural philosophy, but the cover is dark red." Lucian turned. He found her in the shadows with the same immediate ease as before, and if he was surprised to find her there, it did not reach his expression. "I am not here for border law," he said. "What are you here for?" He was quiet for a moment, and in the firelight, the old library felt smaller than its stone walls suggested. The shelves pressing close, the flames casting everything in amber and shadow. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, and she could hear the faint hiss of it against the leaded window glass. "This is where Serana used to come," he said, "in the evenings." The name, said aloud in his own voice in this room, carried a weight that she felt in her sternum. She did not say she was sorry, because she had the sense he had heard that too many times for it to carry meaning anymore. Instead, she said, "She had good taste." He looked at her. "In libraries," Annie added. Something moved through his blue eyes, complicated and layered, arriving and passing in the space of a breath. He pulled out the chair at the near end of the long table and sat down, and she understood that he was not leaving, and neither was she. They sat at opposite ends of the table in the firelight while the snow fell outside, and she read about wolf physiology, and he looked at the fire, and neither of them spoke. And somehow that was the most significant conversation they had yet had. The snow did not let up for 3 days. It settled over Valdenmoor like a held breath, muffling the courtyard sounds and turning the castle into something quieter and more interior than it usually was. The ward grew busier. Cold brought its own particular catalogue of ailments, and Annie worked longer hours, returning to her small room each night with aching hands and the deep, satisfying exhaustion of work that had filled the day completely. The library had become a habit. She did not plan it, exactly. It began with the wolf physiology text she had needed to finish, and then there was a second volume on herbal compounds that Dorvey had pointed her toward with one of his rare nods, and then it was simply where she went in the evenings when the ward was quiet, and the rest of the castle had settled into its night routines. Lucian came perhaps 4 evenings out of 7. He never announced himself, and neither did she, and they had arrived at an arrangement that felt impossibly natural. She at her end of the table with her texts and her notes on small squares of parchment, he at his end with maps or letters, or sometimes nothing at all, simply the fire and the silence. They talked. Not always, and not about everything, but in the way people talk when they have stopped performing for each other, in fragments, in observations, in questions that did not demand immediate answers. She told him about Mira, about the years in Caldenmoor, the long winters when they had been the only warmth some families had, the particular satisfaction of watching a fever break and a child eat for the first time in 3 days. He listened the way she had learned he always listened, completely, without interrupting. His blue eyes on the fire or the table, or occasionally on her face, with an attention that she had stopped trying to deflect. He told her, once, about the northern campaigns, not the violence of them, but the landscape, the way the ice fields reflected light at certain hours in colors she did not have words for. He told her that the scar on his cheekbone was from the first real fight he had been in, at 17, when he had been profoundly overconfident, and a veteran beta soldier had corrected that efficiently and without apology. He said it had been one of the more useful things anyone had ever done for him. She laughed at that, genuinely, and he watched her laugh with an expression she was learning to recognize, that smallest shift at the corner of his mouth that was, she had come to understand, the visible fraction of something much larger happening underneath. It was Pell who brought her the warning, on the 15th evening. He found her in the ward just after the supper hour, his brown eyes wide and his ink-stained hands twisting together in a way that told her before he spoke that what he carried was not small. "There is a man," he said, keeping his voice low despite the fact that they were alone. "He came to the servants' entrance 2 days ago. He has been asking questions about you, about what you know, about the soldiers and the blade treatment." He swallowed. "He is not from any pack I recognize. No seal, no colors. But he spoke to one of the stable hands, and the stable hand told the head groom, and the head groom told me because he knows I work with you." Annie set down the linen she had been folding. "What questions specifically? Whether you had written anything down. Whether you had given documents to anyone. Whether you were—" Pell hesitated. "Likely to stay in Valdenmoor or move on." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You did right to tell me. Say nothing to anyone else. Go about your evening as normal." She met his eyes. "Thank you, Pell." He nodded, visibly relieved to have handed the weight to someone taller, and slipped out. Annie stood in the empty ward for a long moment. The brazier crackled. Outside, snow hissed against the stone. She had documented her findings about the blade treatment in writing, as Wren had instructed. Wren had taken those documents to the Gamma Commander. That meant there was a record, and someone wanted to know how far that record had traveled. Someone who had arranged for poisoned blades at the border skirmish, and was now discovering that a healer in the castle ward had identified the compound. She thought of Mira, who had known about null root reductions and black fern extract. Restricted lore, Wren had called it. She thought of why Mira might have known it. She thought of the old woman's last weeks, feverish and speaking in fragments, saying once, in the middle of the night when she thought Annie was asleep, "They will not stop because you look harmless, child. They will stop when you become a problem they cannot afford." She went to find Wren. Wren listened without moving, her gray eyes fixed and her hands flat on the table. When Annie finished, she was silent for 4 full seconds, which was longer than her usual silences. "Come with me," she said. She did not take Annie to the Gamma Commander. She took her, instead, up 2 flights of stairs that Annie had never climbed, through a corridor lined with iron torches, and guarded at the far end by 2 soldiers who stepped aside immediately when they saw Wren's healer's sash and to a heavy oak door studded with iron nails. Wren knocked once. "Enter," said a voice that Annie knew. The room was a council chamber, maps on the walls, a long table of dark wood, candles in iron stands throwing overlapping circles of light. Lucian stood at the far side of the table, and he was not alone. Beside him stood a broad man of middle years with a soldier's build and a Gamma Commander's silver chain, and on Lucian's other side, rigid and pale in the candlelight, stood Lady Isolde. Annie stopped just inside the door. Wren stepped forward and spoke before anyone else could. "The girl has been approached. Someone is investigating what she documented about the border blades. This is connected." She set a folded square of parchment on the table, documents Annie recognized as her own signed notes. "Read the compound names." The Gamma Commander, whose name Annie had learned was Davan, leaned over the parchment. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a tightening across the shoulders that told her he recognized what he was reading. "Null root and black fern," he said. "A combination that appears in exactly one source in the kingdom's restricted archives," Wren said. A record of compound treatments compiled for the old border garrison 15 years ago. She paused. A record that was accessed 3 months ago. I checked the archive log this afternoon. She looked directly at Lady Isolde. Access was granted under House Varen's research seal. The silence in the room was absolute. Isolde's amber eyes moved from Ren to Annie, with an expression that had lost all of its careful pleasantness. What remained underneath was something colder and more honest, and somehow that honesty was worse than the performance had been. "This is an accusation without foundation," Isolde said, her voice perfectly level. "It is an observation," Ren said, equally level. "The foundation is in the archive records. Commander Devon can retrieve them tonight." Lucian had not spoken. He stood at the far side of the table and watched everything with those still blue eyes. And Annie understood, watching him, that he had already known some of this. Perhaps not all, but enough to have called this gathering before Ren arrived. The parchment on the table, the presence of Devon, the specific torchlight hour. None of this had been accidental. Isolde turned to Lucian with the full force of her composure. "My Lord King, whatever questions the archive raises, I would ask to address them privately, as befits." "You arranged for the blade treatment," Lucian said. His voice was entirely quiet. "The border skirmish was meant to weaken the company that holds the northern pass. The pass that controls the trade route that House Varen has been attempting to renegotiate for 4 years. Isolde said nothing. 3 of my soldiers have spent 2 weeks unable to heal because of a compound applied to enemy blades. A compound that required restricted knowledge and deliberate access. He looked at her steadily. The healer identified it in 11 days. It took my own advisors 3 weeks to suspect anything at all. I will not be condemned on the word of an unbound Omega ward assistant, Isolde said, and her voice, for the first time, carried an edge beneath the smoothness. You will be examined on the evidence, Lucian said, as anyone in this kingdom is. Rank does not change that. He looked at Devon. Take her to the Eastern Tower. Respectfully. Send word to House Varen's head by morning. Devon moved, and Isolde went, not struggling, because she was too composed for that, but with the particular stillness of someone revising their plans at speed. At the door, she paused and looked back at Annie with those amber eyes. And for just a moment, something passed through her expression that was almost close to recognition. Then she was gone, and the door closed, and the room breathed again. Annie stood by the door for a moment, not certain if she was meant to remain or go. Ren was speaking quietly with Davin over the parchment, pointing to specific lines in the documentation, and the two of them moved together toward the corridor. Ren glanced back at Annie as she passed and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that meant, well done, and I will not say it again. And then it was only Lucian and Annie in the council chamber, the candles burning steadily, the maps on the walls casting their own kind of geography over the room. He came around the end of the table, not quickly, and stopped a few feet from where she stood. He was close enough that she could see the old scar along his cheekbone clearly in the candlelight, the fine lines of old battles written across the backs of his hands, the particular quality of tiredness around his eyes that was not physical, but the kind that accumulated over years. You could have been in danger, he said, if you had spoken to the wrong person about what you found. I know, she said. I spoke to the right ones. You spoke to Pell, a 16-year-old apprentice, who told me immediately and without hesitation. She met his eyes. People are trustworthy, or they are not. The length of time you have known them has very little to do with it. He looked at her for a long moment. You are going to tell me that also applies to kings. I was not going to say anything of the sort, she said. And then, because she had stopped performing for him some time ago, though it does. The corner of his mouth moved. Not almost, this time. Enough to see clearly. enough to understand that it was real, that it was one of the few expressions on his face that he had not chosen, but that had simply arrived. "Annie of Caldenmore," he said. "Healer's apprentice. No pack affiliation." "That is still accurate," she said. "It does not have to remain so." He said it quietly and without pressure, the way he said things that mattered. Plainly, without ornament, leaving all of the space in the world for whatever answer came back. "The ward needs a senior healer. Wren has already spoken to Brother Oswin. The posting would be permanent, with the standing that comes with it. Pack affiliation under the Iron Blood seal, if you choose it." He paused. "And whatever else you choose." She looked at him. The candles burned. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour, and through the narrow window she could see the courtyard below, white and still and clean, the flagstones buried and the world made temporarily simple. She thought of the copper coin, cold in her hand in the market square. She thought of doors closing, one after another, in a city that had not known her name. She thought of falling, of catching an iron handle in the dark and tumbling through into something she had not planned and could not have predicted. She thought of an empty library and a fire, and a man who had sat at the other end of a table and looked at the flames and, in doing so, had shown her more of himself than most people showed in a year of conversation. "The ward," she said. "Yes, I choose the ward." She held his gaze steadily. "The rest, I would like more time." "You have it," he said, immediately and without disappointment, which told her more than a declaration would have. She nodded. He nodded. And that was, for now, enough. The kind of enough that had solid ground under it, that did not need to be more than it was yet because what it was already carried weight and warmth, and the particular quality of something that had been chosen carefully by both sides. Spring came to Valdenmoor in the way spring always did after a hard winter, tentatively at first, then all at once. The frost retreated from the courtyard stones. Moss returned to the gaps between the flagstones. The raven that had watched Annie from the tower wall on her first day in the courtyard reappeared on the same ledge, as if resuming a post it had never truly abandoned. The healing ward expanded. Annie was named senior healer under Brother Oswin's formal recommendation and Wren's quiet, unambiguous support. Pell was given a full apprentice's sash, which he accepted with ink-stained hands and an expression of profound seriousness. The 3 border soldiers were returned to full health and duty. Corin stopped at the ward door on his last morning to offer Annie a short soldier's bow that she suspected cost him considerably in personal dignity, and that she found, accordingly, rather moving. Lady Isolde faced the council's examination, and was found to have acted without the knowledge or approval of House Varen's lord, her own elder brother, who cooperated fully, and with visible relief. She was removed from court, and returned to her family's holdings in the south, where she would remain. The border company was reinforced, the northern pass held. Wren did not soften exactly, but she expanded, the way certain materials do under steady warmth, revealing a flexibility that had always been there beneath the surface. She began telling Annie stories about Mira's years in the capital, stories that revealed, slowly and without fanfare, that the 2 women had known each other. That Mira had written to Wren when she knew she was dying, and in that letter had mentioned a girl she had trained, stubborn, precise, and entirely unwilling to look harmless when it would have been easier. She had asked Wren to watch for her, if she ever came to the city. Annie received this information sitting at the work table in the ward on a mild spring morning, and she sat with it for a long time before she was ready to speak, and Wren did not rush her, because Wren had finally understood what kind of person she was dealing with. "She planned this," Annie said at last. "She hoped," Wren said gently. "There is a difference." Annie thought about that distinction for a long time afterward, about the difference between a plan and a hope, and about what it meant that someone who loved you could plant a hope like a seed and not live to see if it took root. She thought about Mira's hands, and her voice, and the smell of dried herbs in the small house in Caldenmore, and she let herself grieve cleanly and fully for the first time since she had left. And then she went back to work, because that was also what Mira had taught her. On a warm evening in late spring, Annie sat at her end of the library table, the windows open for the first time in months, the smell of new leaves and night air drifting through. Across the table, Lucian read correspondence from the Eastern lords, making occasional notes in the margin with a quill he had to replace twice because he pressed too hard. She had pointed this out to him on the third evening she had observed it, and he had looked at the broken nib with an expression of mild personal betrayal that she had been quietly fond of ever since. He looked up. She was already looking at him, and she did not look away. He set down the quill, gently, this time, and held her gaze with those winter blue eyes that she had first seen in the swaying dark of a locked carriage. The eyes of a man who had seemed, in that first moment, like something immovable and unknowable, and who had turned out to be, in the particular ways that mattered, neither. "Stay," he said. One word, quiet and plain. The same word she understood that he had offered in the council chamber in winter, but arrived further now, carrying more of what he meant. Annie looked at him for a long moment, at the scar on his cheekbone and the ink at his fingers, and the careful, patient stillness of a man who had learned the hard way that the things worth keeping were worth waiting for. "I am not going anywhere," she said. And she meant it the way she meant the things that were true down to the bone. Without performance, without reservation. With the full weight of someone who had fallen through the wrong door and found, on the other side of it, exactly where she was supposed to be. Outside, the raven called once from its tower ledge. The candles burned warm and steady. The library settled into the kind of silence that was not empty, but full of two people who had chosen each other not in a single dramatic moment, but in 100 small ones. Each one as deliberate and as real as the last. That was how it ended, and how it began, and how it remained.